All right, the second hormone produced by the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary is antidiuretic hormone. Okay, an antidiuretic hormone causes the kidneys, the nephrons specifically of the kidneys, to reabsorb water instead of eliminating that water as urine. Okay, and we're going to learn a lot more in the urinary system about nephrons and kidneys. But a lot of people, before they take Bio 211, when they think of the urinary system and of the kidneys, they think that they realize that it's a filter. Okay, the kidneys are a filter, and then they create pee and we just get rid of things. And in fact, that's very literally the opposite of what the kidneys and specifically the functional units of the kidneys, the nephrons, do. They're really recycling centers. In fact, the nephrons in the kidneys reabsorb of all the blood they filter, they reabsorb, recycle 99% of what is filtered. Only 1% is excreted as urine ultimately. Okay, but it's that fine-tooth comb of going through things by the nephrons and filtering for what does the body need to maintain homeostasis again, much like we're talking about here with the endocrine system, as to what gets reabsorbed. So in this case, if our blood plasma volume is low, okay, and if you remember when we talked in lab, we talked about blood, right, and the formed elements. The erythrocytes, the leukocytes, and the platelets is about 40% of blood. Roughly 60% of our blood is plasma, and about 80% of plasma is water. That's the liquid portion. Okay, so if we have trauma and we have blood loss, if we have severe dehydration due to illness or fatigue or exertion, we have decreased plasma volumes. Okay, so when we have decreased plasma volumes, we're going to have a decrease in blood volume. And when we have a decrease in blood volume, we have a decrease in blood pressure, because blood pressure is nothing more than the force of blood on the walls of the arteries, like a garden hose. If you turn on your garden hose very, very minimally, and there's just a trickle of water coming, there's no pressure on the rubber wall of the hose at all. But if you have a high output spigot or fountain of sorts, and you crank it up to full, you're going to have pressure on the wall of the hose, right? That's what blood pressure is. Okay, so when plasma volumes, water content in blood, get low, there's less blood, so there's less pressure on the wall. And then we certainly don't want to have low blood pressure. And so as a result, the hypothalamus and receptors in the arteries are going to sense that homeostasis has been disrupted. For whatever reason, there's a decrease in blood volume, blood plasma. It's going to signal the hypothalamus, which in turn will signal the posterior pituitary gland, which will release antidiuretic hormone, which will work at the kidney level to cause those kidneys to recycle water instead of excreting it as urine, bring it back into the bloodstream, restoring plasma volumes and blood pressure with it. Okay? Oops. All right. So let's go ahead and continue from there. So this is what I just explained with blood hydrostatic pressure. That's what the type of pressure is that blood pressure is. Hydro meaning liquid, and it's just the pressure on the arterial wall. And like I just described to you when I was talking about the effects of the hormone, antidiuretic hormone, when we have a low plasma volume, it only makes sense that we would have low blood pressure. If we have a high water concentration, high plasma volumes, we're going to have higher blood pressure. Now, contrary to a lot of people's beliefs, because there's a lot of public service advertising done about high blood pressure, because it is a very valid risk factor. It's very detrimental and harmful. But low blood pressure is actually more dangerous than high. And the reason for that is if we have low blood pressure, what is blood carrying? It's carrying oxygen and nutrients to all of our cells, tissues, and organs, right? So if we don't have oxygen and nutrients going to our cells, they're going to die very rapidly. So low blood pressure, while it's much more rare and uncommon, is actually much more threatening than high blood pressure is. Okay, so that's what antidiuretic hormone is. It's all about increasing blood pressure along with a hormone that we're going to talk about later on in lecture here today called aldosterone. We'll talk about that one later. Okay, know for the exam, there is a question related that antidiuretic hormone, the release of antidiuretic hormone by the posterior pituitary is inhibited. In other words, it's blocked by the consumption of alcohol. Okay, ethyl alcohol is the type of alcohol that are spirits that people drink, beer, wine, liquor. Okay, so anyone that's been out a night on the town, right, and had a few glasses of wine, okay, realizes what happens, right, when you start to consume alcohol at a higher volume. You start to urinate a lot, right? Much more than you otherwise would. That's because ethyl alcohol, the alcohol that we drink, negates the effect of antidiuretic hormone. It inhibits it, it blocks the ability of those nephrons to recycle water instead of eliminating it as urine. So all the water in our body that's getting flushed out of our blood and filtered while you're drinking ethyl alcohol gets excreted as urine. Okay. And honestly, that's exactly what contributes in a major way to a hangover. Okay. A hangover is dehydration, it's severe fluid loss. And the reason for that is because antidiuretic hasn't been able to work. You've urinated out much more fluid than water fluid than you normally would. So in the morning, you're left exceptionally dehydrated. All right, so that is antidiuretic hormone and its relationship to the posterior pituitary gland. Again, I've already talked about this. Antidiuretic hormone targets the nephrons in the kidneys to reabsorb more water. Okay? All right, so let's move then. That's the posterior pituitary. Let's move to the anterior pituitary. And there's actually a lot more going on there. Again, stimulated by the hypothalamus, but this time not neural in stimulation, going to be hormonally stimulated. So this is where we're going to introduce the concept of inhibiting hormones and releasing hormones. These are hormones that are created and stored in the hypothalamus specifically to impact the anterior pituitary gland. And as the names describe, releasing hormones cause the anterior pituitary gland to release a type of hormone. Okay, and it might be out into the circulation toward effector cells to repair or fix some disruption. But usually, as we'll see, when the hypothalamus stimulates releasing hormones to the anterior pituitary, typically it's going to be to stimulate yet another, a third endocrine gland to release a hormone that's going to correct for whatever the situation is. Okay, so back to that infundibulum that connects the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, you can see here the vasculature that connects the two. Okay, veins, not nerves like the posterior. Okay, this vascular system that connects the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary is called the hypophyseal portal system. Okay, important that you know the hypophyseal portal system. Okay, that's what this vasculature, this vascular network is that brings inhibiting and releasing hormones from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, the inhibiting hormones, of course, are like an off switch. If the releasing hormones are an on switch and they cause the anterior pituitary to secrete hormones, the inhibiting hormones released by the hypothalamus through the hypophyseal portal system turn off the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. Think of them like a light switch. Releasing turns it on, inhibiting turns them off. All right, so like I said, the anterior lobe, we said it's called adenohypophysis. Adeno in Latin means gland. Okay, it's glandular in nature. It has a vasculature that runs through the infundibulum. You can see here it's underlined. As I said, you'll need to remember this for the test. And it's the hypophyseal portal system that connects the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary and transports those releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones from that hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. Okay, we've talked about what releasing and inhibitory hormones are just a minute ago. All right. Okay, so let's now talk about what are those hormones produced by the hypothalamus, released through the hypophyseal portal system, with the target being the anterior pituitary gland. So there are 4 releasing hormones, and there are 2 inhibiting hormones that we'll see on the next slide. Okay, and remember, these releasing hormones stimulate the anterior pituitary to in turn release, secrete some hormones. Okay, the first one is thyrotropin releasing hormone. There's corticotropin releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, and growth hormone releasing hormone. And we can tell from the root words of most of these, we can probably guess, in the region at least, where the impact is going to, what the end game is here, right? Thyroid row is going to be targeting the thyroid. Cortico is going to be steroid in nature. Gonado is going to trigger and action target the gonads, ovaries in females, testicles in males. And then growth hormone is a really important one in the human body because, as you guys remember from Bio 210, growth hormone, our body is constantly going through mitosis, generating new cells, new tissues, replacing. Think of our epidermis, constant regeneration of new epidermal tissue cells, right? So growth hormone is a key regulator, a hormone that stimulates mitosis, tissue repair, growth, etc. Okay? So here, I want you guys to know that thyrotropin, gonadotropin, and growth hormone are 3 of the releasing hormones from the hypothalamus. That's what this underlined portion means. All right, these are the 2 inhibiting hormones. Again, it's the ones that deactivate the anterior pituitary gland. Prolactin, and that's going to have to do with lactation. We'll talk about each of these in the coming slides, how they relate to the anterior pituitary hormones. But prolactin is an inhibiting hormone that turns off lactation, okay? And then you'll see growth hormone, yet again. So growth hormone is a little unique that it's the only one that the hypothalamus releases both a growth hormone releasing or stimulating hormone on switch for the release of growth hormone by the anterior pituitary, but also an off switch to stop the release of growth hormone by the anterior pituitary. All right, so let's talk now about the anterior pituitary. Those are the 6 inhibiting or releasing hormones that pass through the hypophyseal portal system from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. Now, what happens at the anterior pituitary? Let's talk about those. There are 6 different hormones that the anterior pituitary gland produces. Remember, the posterior only houses hormones, it doesn't produce. Anterior does. They're all protein-based, okay? And 4 of the 6 are what we call tropic hormones. They're tropins, okay? And what tropic means is, like I described earlier, they're going to be released by the anterior pituitary gland to go out and stimulate a different endocrine gland down the line to in turn release its hormones, okay? The 2 that are non-tropic in nature, non-tropin hormones, have a direct receptor relationship like any other hormone would, okay? So you can see it's underlined. You definitely want to know what are the hormones of the anterior pituitary gland. We're going to go through these one by one, okay? We have the thyroid stimulating hormone, the adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone, prolactin, and then growth hormone again, that ever important and constantly appearing growth hormone, okay? Remember, tropic hormones are those chain reactors. Okay, the hypothalamus stimulates the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary releases a tropic hormone, which then stimulates yet another endocrine organ to release its hormones. All right, so let's start with thyroid stimulating hormone. I think you guys can probably guess where we're headed with this hormone for effector cells, right? We're targeting the thyroid gland, right? All right, so at the anterior pituitary, now we're going to go all the way back 2 steps, back to the hypothalamus. Remember, the releasing hormone that the hypothalamus sends to the anterior pituitary is that thyrotropin releasing hormone. That causes the anterior pituitary gland to release thyroid stimulating hormone produced by the thyroid gland itself. And then that thyroid stimulating hormone is going to release T3 or T4 or trioiodothyronine or thyroxine. Okay, both T3 and T4, like most of the thyroid gland function, is related to metabolism. Okay, and we're going to talk a lot more later in the course about metabolism. Metabolism is just the effectiveness and the way the human body converts calories and food into ATP, energy, and heat. Okay, how effectively does our body use energy and nutrients that we ingest? Okay, oftentimes you'll hear people with thyroid conditions or an underperforming thyroid, sometimes related to obesity, because there's an underlying problem with the thyroid gland and or the hormones of the thyroid gland. That's because the thyroid is the major regulator and player that controls our metabolism. Okay, how fast do we burn calories versus storing them as fat? All right, to the second of the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary. This is the adrenocorticotropic hormones, okay? This is going to be stimulated by corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, okay? And this one is actually released more like melatonin is by the pineal gland that we talked about related to our sleep cycle. This is more of a daily rhythm type hormone than a disruption of homeostasis. The action and the secretion levels are highest early in the day, in the morning hours, and then it really diminishes in the evening hours. And that's because adrenocorticotropic hormone is responsible with preventing our body from the damages of stress and inflammation. Okay, so our body has this natural built-in protective effect that as the day begins and our body kind of comes to life as we wake from sleep, to release adrenocorticotropic hormone out into the bloodstream to kind of lay down a buffer, if you will, to protect our body throughout the day from stress and inflammation from the wear and tear of what we're going to encounter during the day. Okay. All right. And then we'll combine the next two, the gonadotropins. Okay. And these are the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Okay. And these are tropic hormones also that are going to head toward the gonads. Okay. Ovaries for females, testicles for males. These are stimulated to be released from the anterior pituitary gland by the gonadotropin releasing hormone in the hypothalamus, okay? This is what causes the onset of puberty, when someone reaches that age. Of course, and that age varies widely, but let's just say somewhere around 12, 13 years of age on average, okay? The hypothalamus will sense that the organism, the human body is mature, reproduction is potential, and the stimulation of these hormones will begin, okay? Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone hit the testicles for males and ovaries for females, which are, as we know, part of both the reproductive system as well as the endocrine system. And then that follicle stimulating hormone will stimulate the growth of follicles in the ovaries, which relate to the development of ovum, eggs that are mature and can be fertilized. And then in males, it's in the testicles, stimulates the production of sperm cells called spermatogenesis. Okay? Luteinizing hormone is the second of the gonadotropins that stimulates ovulation, the menstrual cycle of the ovaries, and produces testosterone in the testicles for among males. All right, so those were the four of the tropic hormones released by and produced by the anterior pituitary. So now we're going to talk about the last two hormones produced by the anterior pituitary. And these are just normal hormones, if you will. They're not tropic. They're non-tropic in nature. They're looking for their own receptor cells to do something very specific. They're going direct to a target. And prolactin is the target. You can see that this is underlined, so you'll want to know it. Prolactin stimulates lactation, okay, around the time of childbirth, okay, among females, okay? We really don't understand. Males do have prolactin, but for the most part, it's believed that it just kind of circulates and is cleaned out. There's really no effect of it, okay? But know that prolactin is what stimulates or turns on lactation around the time of childbirth for a pregnant mom. And then prolactin inhibiting hormone will turn that lactation, the production of milk, off when it's time. And then growth hormone is the last one, again, produced by the anterior pituitary gland. And growth hormone is regulated by receptors, okay? We have a lot of receptors in our arteries. People think of our arteries, and we'll learn more about these when we talk about the cardiovascular system, but they're not just tubes that carry our blood around, okay? Our arteries have receptors, little monitors mounted in the walls of those arteries, and they're constantly detecting things like pH level, plasma fluid levels, for example, glucose levels, in this case, growth hormone level, calcium levels, all kinds of things are constantly being monitored by these receptors embedded in the walls of arteries that then send a signal to the brain if something is out of normal range, okay? So right now we're talking about growth hormone. So there's a percentage of growth hormone that is normal in our blood level. And if there's a low volume of blood-borne growth hormone or glucose, growth hormone releasing hormone will stimulate the release of growth hormone to drive that volume back up to normal levels. And then, of course, the opposite is true. If we have a high level of growth hormone circulating in our bloodstream, the growth hormone inhibiting hormone will be released, and that will stop the dumping of further growth hormone into the bloodstream to try to drive that number and volume down to normal volumes. All right, so when we have disruptions to the anterior pituitary gland and specifically to growth hormone, they can cause a couple of conditions that we've probably all heard of before called gigantism and dwarfism, okay? And this is either an overstimulation, oversecretion of growth hormone, or an under secretion or over inhibition of growth hormone. Okay. For those of you that are remember or may have seen in a movie or heard of, Andre the Giant was someone that I used as an explanation of gigantism. He was a wrestler from the 1980s. He was also a one-time actor. It was a pretty dismal performance, but in The Princess Bride, he had a role, and it was pretty embarrassing, to be honest with you. But Andre the Giant had gigantism because his growth hormone was unregulated. His anterior pituitary gland continued to constantly spill growth hormone into his blood. And it caused him to grow to almost 8 feet tall and weigh 400 and some pounds. Okay, he was a giant, gigantism. The downside with gigantism is that the human body and our organs and our organ systems aren't developed or designed to accompany that type of size. So people, including Andre the Giant, live only until typically their lifespan is around the 30s. And that, in fact, is what happened to him. Okay, the body can't support that stature. And then the opposite is dwarfism, of course. When our anterior pituitary gland doesn't produce enough growth hormone, then the human being will grow to a more diminutive or restricted size than what we would call a quote unquote average size. All right, so first of two, and remember there's only 2 extra credit attendance verification questions because we split this chapter. This looks like a long one, but really what I'm looking for is what are the vessels that connect the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland, carrying those releasing and inhibiting hormones. All right, is that called the general circulatory system, the hypophyseal portal system, or the hepatic portal system? All right, we'll continue. All right, so the thyroid gland. Let's talk now about the thyroid gland as we move down. The thyroid gland is, as you can see in the illustration here, it's kind of a butterfly-shaped gland. It wraps around the posterior of the trachea that we'll see in a couple of slides, but it just lies, this is an anterior view, lies right over the trachea just above the heart, okay? And the thyroid gland, once again, typically, when we talk about the thyroid gland, we're talking and thinking of metabolism, okay? All right. All right, so the major metabolic hormones, again, I introduced these previously, are T3 and T4, triiodothyronine or thyroxine, okay? Both of these hormones influence metabolism, the cellular rate at which the body burns fuel or nutrients that we ingest. Nutrients that we ingest from our food and beverages that we don't burn at the cellular level get stored as fat. Okay, so that's where metabolism has to do with weight management. Okay, so you'll notice that triiodothyronine has iodine embedded in it. Oftentimes, when we talk about the thyroid gland, we're talking about iodine because hormones of the thyroid are iodine containing hormones. And that's the most common blood test of thyroid function, measures iodine levels in the body to determine if the hormones may be compensated somehow. They're the lipid soluble variety. And what I want you to know for the exam is that T3 and T4, these metabolic hormones from the thyroid gland, because they're lipid soluble, can make their way right through the plasma membrane, right into the cell without issue. We don't have to use that secondary messenger system that we talked about. Okay?
Doctor, fine.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Someone had put in the chat if you could go back to, I believe it was one of the questions.
Yeah, yeah. The answer is no, I can't. And the reason is I appreciate you showing that, and please don't if no one screenshot it or send it or share these answers, or you'll lose your extra credit points. Okay, the whole point of these extra credit points is to make sure that every one of you are sitting actively listening. So if someone is out in the kitchen and they don't make it back in time, then that's on them. Okay. So you attendance is sitting here just as if you are sitting, giving me your 100% attention. Okay. So that's why we
Okay,
can't
did you
have
want
any
us
sharing. Okay.
okay, did you want us to answer that question right there and then or wait till after the class?
No, what you're going to do is like always. You're going to write those answers down, and within 15 minutes of the lecture, you're going to email me those answers. Okay. And those
Okay.
are your
Okay.
proof of attendance and your extra credit.
Mr. Jeff, I got one question. Could you go back to the first slide right there where I see that picture?
Yes, Brianna, it's Dr. Fine.
Oh,
First of
oh,
all,
oh, Dr.
48
Fine.
years of college, I stopped being Mr. Jeff a long time ago.
Okay, Dr. Fine.
But okay, and where do you want me to go back to, please?
Just to the picture.
Absolutely, I can certainly do that. There we go. So here's that thyroid gland, okay? That's all it's showing. It's just where the thyroid gland exists in the human body. All right, so transport. All right, the thyroid gland and the metabolic hormones are related and controlled by that negative feedback loop that we've talked about previously, right? There's a problem that creates the release of a thyroid stimulating hormone. And when things are restored, when homeostasis is rebalanced, negative feedback will turn off the production of thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, we've talked about that multiple times already. All right, calcium is one of those things that I mentioned that our receptors in our arteries monitor. Much like pH, the level of calcium that's acceptable is extremely narrow. Okay, pH, for example, 5/100ths of a percentage, either too acidic or too alkalytic, can cause organ failure. Okay, blood calcium is only 9 to 11 milligrams per 100 milliliters of blood is the normal readout. So it's an extremely small bandwidth of calcium that's acceptable in the human body. Okay, and calcium is a vital component in the human body for obvious reasons. If we think about it, you've all been through Bio 210 successfully, right? Okay, we need calcium for muscle contractions to occur, right? Calcium is released at the sarcolemma, causing the muscle body to contract. Okay, our neurons need a presence of calcium to be there to maintain that resting polarity for the action potential and the resting membrane potential to be able to send an impulse down the neuron. Okay, it's responsible, as this slide shows, for blood clotting, for osteogenesis, the creation of bone tissue, a variety of things. Okay, so calcium is really, really important. And the reason I'm talking about that is we're going to talk about calcium in the next slides. So calcitonin, when that calcium level gets above 11 milliliters, a disruption of homeostasis, okay, calcitonin will be released, okay, to drive the calcium level back down to normal, okay? Calcitonin will not be released if the calcium levels in our blood diminish below normal levels. Okay, so what this means by humoral stimulus, whenever we're talking about humoral, we're talking about some measure of blood system-wide. So again, these are these blood-borne receptors, the vasculature receptors that we talk about. Okay, parathyroid hormone produces and adds calcium, and we're going to see that on the next slide. Okay, so here's on the next two slides rather. So here's a posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. Okay, we're looking at the back of the throat, the back of the trachea. We saw the butterfly. Here's the thyroid gland wrapped around the posterior. And now we see for the first time the parathyroid glands. And the parathyroid glands are little button-like glands embedded in the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. All right. What's unique about the parathyroid glands is that they are variable in the number that humans have, largely dependent on your genetics. The typical range of the number of parathyroid glands are between 4 and 8. Again, varies between individuals. Okay. The parathyroid glands secrete parathyroid hormone. Probably no surprise, right? So parathyroid hormone in turn releases and increases the volume of calcium in the blood. Okay, so calcitonin that we just talked about restricts or drives down the level of calcium in blood. Parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid glands increases levels of blood-borne calcium. Okay, so they're opposites of one another. So know for the exam that the parathyroid hormone is the most important hormone to managing the homeostatic balance of calcium in blood. All right, and here we can see some downstream on this flow chart, some downstream effects of parathyroid hormone from those parathyroid glands. Okay, so again, it all starts with a disruption of homeostasis called hypocalcemia when we're talking about low blood volumes of calcium. Hypo meaning under, low, calcium, calcemia. So hypocalcemia is detected by a receptor, stimulates the parathyroid glands to in turn release or secrete parathyroid hormone to increase the level of calcium in our blood. Now, what happens from there? Well, one effect of increased calcium in blood is the osteoclasts and osteocytes will start to lay down new cartilage and calcification of bone. Bone mineral density and growth can occur. The biggest one is calcium then it'll stimulate the kidneys. Once again, those nephrons of our kidneys that are our recycling centers to reabsorb calcium that might have come from our diet and bring it back into the blood to drive calcium levels back up. Okay. Also, an effect at the kidney level is that parathyroid hormone can activate vitamin D, which in turn activates the small intestine to reabsorb more calcium from our food back into the bloodstream. All of the above are going to increase calcium volumes in the blood and restore homeostasis. And these are just several of many different impacts of the release of parathyroid hormone. All right, let's move down to the adrenal glands. And if you remember from last time, the adrenal glands are on top of each of the kidneys. They're triangular endocrine glands, as you can see in the illustration over on the left-hand side. They're divided into a medulla meaning middle in Latin, and then a cortex, just like the cerebral cortex, just that outer bandwidth, the outer triangle aspect of the adrenal glands, okay? Very, very different function within the adrenal glands between the medulla and the cortex, okay? The medulla, that middle range, is stimulated by nervous system impulse. These are categorically our catecholamine hormones, the epinephrine and norepinephrine, responsible for fight or flight or panic, okay, survival. Whereas the cortex lays down a lot of steroid-based, for the most part, hormones that work as quote unquote typical hormones. They're going to flow into the bloodstream and act on effector cells that have receptors. Okay, so if we look at a histology slide here in the middle, a cutaway of what the adrenal gland would look like, we'll start most superior or most superficially is going to be just a fibrotic capsule, like most organs have, fiber, connective tissue that's just going to protect the gland. okay? But as we move deeper, there are 3 different layers of the adrenal cortex: the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and then the zona reticularis being the deepest, okay? And they do different things, okay? The zona glomerulosa releases the hormone and produces the hormone aldosterone, which I previewed is going to be related to blood pressure control and regulation. We'll talk more about it. The fasciculata, the middle layer of the adrenal cortex, produces cortisols and androgens. Cortisols are steroids, androgens are sex trait related hormones. And the reticularis, that deepest layer, also produces cortisol and androgens. Okay, and then if we move even deeper in, we're into that medulla. We've left the 3 layers of the cortex, and now we're talking about those catecholamines that I mentioned, epinephrine and norepinephrine, our fight or flight. All right, so like I said, pyramid, triangular shaped organs on top of each kidney. We've talked that the cortex has the 3 layers that both create and secrete steroid-based hormones, okay? The medulla is part of the nervous system, part of the sympathetic nervous system, that part that activates a body response, and the medulla, of course, is in the middle of the adrenal gland. Again, epinephrine, norepinephrine, those things that ramp up a body response, okay? Think of any type of startling effect, right? Your heart rate increases, your respiratory rate increases, your pupils dilate, blood is focused to your core organs, your body goes into survival mode. Those are epinephrine, norepinephrine, produced and released by the adrenal medulla via the nervous system. And that's why they're instantaneous. Remember back the beginning of last lecture, I mentioned that nervous system regulation of hormones was much faster. It was more succinct in the area that it impacts, and it was much more intense and short-lived. That's how epinephrine and norepinephrine work, right? You get startled, but it doesn't last 45 minutes, okay? Whereas hormones can last for hours, if not days. All right, so the adrenal cortex, let's talk about those 3 layers, that outer band of the adrenal glands. So over 24 hormones in total called corticosteroids. They're steroid-based hormones, and steroid-based hormones are unique because they cannot be stored at the cellular level in the body, okay? So the only way the body can utilize steroid-based hormones, corticosteroids, is at the rate that the adrenal cortex produces them, okay? And when we talk about the categories of hormones, the glomerulosa, the outer band of the cortex, produces what are called mineralocorticoids. The fasciculata, the middle layer of the cortex, produces glucocorticoids. And then the reticularis, the innermost layer that articulates or meets with the medulla, produces gonadocorticoids. And we can see from the root words what they're based in, right? The glomerulosa, these are going to be mineral-based steroids. The fasciculata is going to produce glucose-driven corticoids or sugar-based corticoid steroids. And the reticularis, gonadocorticoids that are going to act at the gonad level, at the ovaries or testicles. All right, let's talk about aldosterone. This is the most important mineral corticoid produced by that outer layer, the zona glomerulosa of the cortex, okay? Very, very important, short-lived, but again, working to regulate blood pressure, okay? There is one adage in human science and that I really want you guys to remember. I know with my Bio 210 classes, I always share this important scientific concept. Please remember, because we're going to talk about this a lot throughout the course this semester, that where sodium goes, water follows, okay? Where sodium goes, water follows. The human body needs fluid. We are roughly 65% water, okay? But the human body on a cellular level and at a tissue or organ system level is not particularly effective at redistributing or moving water from one location to the other, okay? But it's extremely good at moving sodium from one area of the body to another. So that's where that scientific principle comes in. The body, where it needs water, it's going to stimulate or redirect sodium, knowing that the water will follow it. And that's why that scientific principle is really, really important. So in the case of aldosterone with blood pressure, if we run into a situation where you're severely dehydrated or you've had some trauma and extensive bleeding, okay, and your blood plasma volume is exceptionally low and your blood pressure then is low, okay, aldosterone will be released by the adrenal glands, by the cortex, and that will stimulate sodium to be reabsorbed from the kidneys back into the bloodstream. Okay, and when sodium is reabsorbed back into the bloodstream, then water will follow from the kidneys, and that will increase plasma volumes, and with it, increase blood plasma volumes and blood pressure, restoring normal. Okay? So that's why aldosterone is so important in blood pressure regulation. It's all about stimulating the reabsorption of sodium into the bloodstream at the kidney level instead of eliminating it as waste with our urine. And it's all for blood pressure and plasma volumes. All right, so those were the mineral corticoids, talking about one type, aldosterone, okay? The glucocorticoids produced by the middle layer of the adrenal cortex, and if you remember, that's called the fasciculata, okay? They're glucocorticoids. Anything time we hear gluco, we should be thinking glucose, we should be thinking metabolism, okay? Blood sugar. Glucocorticoids are steroid hormones that they assist the pancreas to maintain normal blood glucose levels. Too high of sugar, we have organ failure. Too low of blood sugar, we have organ failure. Okay? Very sensitive to blood sugar, blood glucose levels. Okay, so glucocorticoids produced by the adrenal glands help the pancreas to maintain normal blood glucose levels. Okay, the pancreas is the major player, but glucocorticoids assist with the process. Okay, cortisol is a hormone that most of us have probably heard of. It's really the only glucocorticoid that can be measured in humans. Okay, so it's really just cortisol. All right, and cortisol is important as it relates, again, to energy and metabolism and glucose monitoring, because cortisol will increase blood sugar levels by stimulating a process that we're going to talk about a lot more when we talk about metabolism later in the semester, called gluconeogenesis. Gluco meaning sugar, right? Glucose. Neo meaning new, and genesis meaning creation. Okay, and we're going to talk about glucogenesis and gluconeogenesis and glycolysis, all kinds of different terms later on in the course. But gluconeogenesis is the formation of a brand new glucose from fat and protein. Our body can take nutrients, our primary three nutrients, as all of you already know, are carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, okay? Now, if you've depleted all of your nutrient carbohydrates, whether you're on an Atkins diet where you're not eating any carbs, or if you just ran a marathon and you have no carbs left, okay? You need glucose. Your blood sugar level has dropped. Where does the body reach for it? Well, one place is cortisol. Cortisol can stimulate the process called gluconeogenesis. And that's where the liver will actually convert fat and protein to a carbohydrate into glucose because there is none. It left in the blood. Okay. So that's what gluconeogenesis means. Okay. And it's all about building up body glucose levels to healthy normal levels. All right. And then we have the gonadocorticoids, that last of the adrenal cortex category of hormones. Okay. And again, like I said, the gonadocorticoids are steroid-based hormones that are related to sexual characteristics or traits. Okay. For males, converted to testosterone, some to estrogens. Okay. By the way, males, we have testosterone predominantly as an androgen, a male sex hormone, but males also have estrogen to a lesser extent. Females have predominantly estrogen and progesterone, but they also have testosterone to a lesser extent. Okay, so we all share the same sex hormones, but it's the ratios that are vastly different. Okay, so these gonadocorticoids can kick off or kickstart the onset of puberty, with which comes the appearance of what are called secondary gender or secondary sex characteristics. These are things in males like the deepening of a voice, the development of facial hair, okay, the development of breasts and menstruation for females, things that happen around the time of puberty. Not only does puberty and our ability to reproduce occur because of gonadocorticoids, but also those secondary gender traits or characteristics. All right, and then we're moving into the adrenal medulla. Now we're into the middle, and like I shared with you multiple times already, the category of hormones here are catecholamines, and epinephrine and norepinephrine are the two major players. These are the catecholamine hormones that are stress responses. They're protective sympathetic nervous system responses, fight or flight, to try to protect us and keep us alive. So know for the exam, the vast majority of the catecholamines released is called epinephrine, about 80%, and that is what creates fight or flight syndrome. You hear a gunshot, you're either going to bow up and start to fight for your life, or you're going to flee, right? It's going to create a rapid response. Again, all inherent genetically programmed survival. Second of your quiz questions, let's go back to aldosterone that we just talked about, right? The mineral corticoid produced at the cortex of the adrenal gland. Does aldosterone increase potassium in the blood? Does it promote sodium reabsorption in the kidneys? Or is it secreted by the neurohypophysis? All right, let's continue and finish up. Back to the pineal gland. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this. We talked about this already last time. Remember, this is in the posterior of that midbrain area. Again, the other pea-sized gland, much like the pituitary gland that we kickstarted this lecture with today. That pineal gland, it provides the hormone melatonin that is responsible for our sleep cycle, for regulating our body based on sunrise and sunset, to keep us in a normal circadian rhythm. The pancreas, if you remember, is both an endocrine and an exocrine organ. So it has two body systems, like the gonads, that it contributes toward. In the endocrine world, the hormones that it secretes are going to be glucagon, that increases blood sugar levels, or insulin, that decreases blood glucose level. Like I said, the pancreas is the main player of glucose regulation in blood sugar levels, blood glucose levels, okay? The glucocorticoids are secondary contributors. In the exocrine world, like we'll learn more about when we talk about the digestive system, the pancreas secretes what's called pancreatic juices into the small intestine, which help to break down our food nutrients from carbohydrates, fats, and proteins into monomers that are small enough to be absorbed back into the bloodstream and utilized as energy and fuel. And then let's finish by talking about the thymus gland. The thymus gland is very unique. As I said last time, the thymus gland, what is most unique about it is that most of us no longer have one, okay? The thymus gland is very active in children and young adults. By the time, again, everything is general, okay? All humans are unique and different. So there's no specific day that something changes, okay? But much like the onset of puberty, for the most part, the thymus gland atrophies, meaning dissolves, goes away, disappears around the end of puberty. Okay, and the reason for that is the thymus gland is where our T cells, our T lymphocytes, responsible for our immune system, those warrior cells that are out patrolling our blood for pathogens and bacteria and viruses and tumors, those T lymphocytes mature in the thymus gland. And our body is programmed or timed to believe, anyway, right or wrong, but to believe that by the time we're done with infancy, childhood, and our teenage years, we've pretty much come in contact with most of the external environmental threats that we're going to experience. And then, much like a clock, an inner clock, the thymus gland will atrophy and dissolve. And then from there, those T lymphocytes just circulate exclusively in our blood cell. And we'll be talking more about the T cells when we get into immunity toward the end of January. All right, so that's it. Like I said, as promised, that was a right down the line countdown of all of the endocrine glands, the hormones that they release, or the inhibitory or releasing factor hormones that they release toward other endocrine glands. And again, and as always, you're going to absolutely want to focus on the underlying content. That's what you're going to see with 100% certainty on the lecture exam, okay? My presentations are your guide for studying for the exams. Okay. Any additional questions that we haven't covered so far related to the endocrine system before we take a break and we'll come back for lab?
Just to make sure, all of these are going to be posted to D2L, right?
They are.
Okay, thank you.
That's correct. Absolutely. That's where you will find them. Yes. Yep. Great question, because that's very, very important. All right. So I have 3:32. All right, don't forget, during break, email me your 2 answers. You don't have to type them out. You can just put the letters. Email me the answers for the 2 questions within the break. Let's meet back at 3:45, and we'll pick up with what's going to be a recap of the endocrine system over in the lab world, and you'll get you out of here to enjoy the rest of your afternoon and evening. So we'll see you guys at 3:45.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir.
You're very welcome.